The sound came first, a sharp, flat crack that split the humid Louisiana morning like a gunshot. Not a car backfiring, not a door slamming. Every person within 30 feet stopped moving the moment they heard it because some sounds carry their own gravity, and this one pulled every eye toward the courthouse steps. Walter Gaines was already on one knee by the time they looked. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the careful economy of a man who had learned long ago that a fall at 68 is not the same as a fall at 30. His right hand pressed against the warm marble of the Caldwell Parish Courthouse steps, steadying himself. His left hand reached out for his glasses, which had skittered across the stone and come to rest against the bottom lip of a concrete planter. The left lens cracked clean down the middle. Blood gathered at the corner of his mouth, a thin line of it catching the morning light. He touched his lip with 2 fingers, looked at his hand, then looked up. Officer Dale Pruitt stood directly above him. Boot planted against the leather satchel Walter had carried to that courthouse for one simple, lawful reason. Legal papers scattered across the steps around them, some sliding down toward the sidewalk, some caught by the gentle push of a Gulf Coast breeze tumbling lazily into the open air. 3 other deputies stood under the colonnade behind Pruitt, watching. One of them scrolled his phone. One of them had a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Not one of them moved. Across the street on the opposite sidewalk, a 17-year-old boy named Deshaun Mobley had been walking to the corner store. He stopped mid-stride. His hand was already moving toward his pocket, reaching for his phone before his conscious mind had fully registered what he was seeing. The phone came up. The camera opened. The recording light blinked on. Walter Gaines did not know the boy was filming. He was not thinking about footage or witnesses or what the internet would do with this moment by noon. I was thinking about his glasses. He was thinking about the documents scattered across the steps. He was thinking about the crack in the left lens, which his late wife Ruth had always said made him look distinguished even when he complained about it, and how she was not here to say that anymore. He picked up the glasses, folded the arms slowly, placed them in the breast pocket of his ivory Oxford shirt. He would deal with them later. Right now, he had a hearing to attend. Walter James Gaines had dressed carefully that morning the way he always dressed when something mattered. Charcoal slacks pressed the night before with the kind of precision that came from 40 years of courtrooms. The ivory Oxford with the small collar, not the banded one Ruth preferred because the small collar photographed better in fluorescent light, and he had learned that details mattered in rooms where judgments were made. His cufflinks silver with the scales of justice etched into them, a gift from Ruth after his first major civil rights victory in 1987, when he had stood in the Louisiana Second Circuit and made the argument that a housing authority had systematically denied permits based on race and won. 47 years old that day. Ruth had pressed the box into his hands outside the courthouse doors before he went in and said, "Wear these when it counts." I wore them today. He had retired from active practice 3 years ago, handing the firm to his junior partners with a handshake and a framed copy of the Gaines and Associates founding charter. 34 years. 2 appearances before the Louisiana Supreme Court. The housing discrimination case. The Millbrook School redistricting settlement. 11 other matters that had never made headlines but had changed lives in ways Walter knew mattered more than headlines. He had come to the Caldwell Parish Courthouse that Tuesday morning for something much smaller than any of those. A nuisance ordinance violation. Filed against Greater Mercy, AME Church. The congregation his late wife Ruth had attended for 51 years. The one she had served as treasurer for 22 of those years. The one that sat on the corner of Monroe and Fifth in a neighborhood that certain powerful people in Caldwell Parish had been eyeing for development for the better part of a decade. The ordinance cited the church for excessive noise during Sunday services and improper use of the parking area on a public right-of-way. Walter had the building code in his left folder. He had the zoning variance documentation in the right folder. He had photographs of the parking area with timestamps showing that the congregation parked within legal bounds. He had a signed statement from the city noise inspector who had actually visited the property and found nothing in violation. I had everything. He had been inside hundreds of courtrooms. He knew the rhythm of this kind of hearing. An hour, maybe less. The parish would present the complaint. Walter would present the documentation. A reasonable judge would look at the evidence and dismiss. He had done this before. He would do it today. He would be home by noon. He had also brought tucked into the front pocket of his satchel, alongside his reading glasses, a sealed envelope addressed to his son. A birthday card. Marcus turned 42 in 4 days. Walter had written it the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside him, trying to find the right words. He had settled on something simple because Marcus was not a man who needed elaborate words. He had written, "Still the proudest thing I ever did." He planned to drop it in the mailbox on the corner of Monroe on his way home. I was climbing the courthouse steps, satchel under his arm, when he heard the voice. "You lost, old man?" Walter turned. Patient smile already in place. Not a fake smile. Not a performance. The smile he had spent decades developing, the one that said he was not a threat, that he was simply a man with business to conduct, that he wished this particular moment of necessary navigation was not necessary at all. But here they both were, and could they please just move through it with some dignity? "Good morning, officer," Walter said. "I have a hearing scheduled in courtroom 3B, 9:45. Officer Dale Pruitt was 39 years old, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a jaw that sat permanently forward, and eyes that moved in quick, dismissive sweeps. The kind of eyes that had already decided what they were seeing before they finished looking. 12 years on the Caldwell Parish Force. 4 excessive force complaints in those 12 years, all of them dismissed. 2 civil suits against the parish, both settled quietly. The settlements had come with no admission of wrongdoing and a confidentiality clause that the parish attorney, a man named Gilbert Fenn, had handled with what he privately called institutional efficiency. Pruitt carried himself the way certain men carry themselves when they have learned that consequences are optional. Loose. Slightly too loose. The looseness of a man who had been told repeatedly and in many different ways that someone would always handle it. "Let me see some ID." Walter shifted the satchel to his left hand and reached into his jacket. His license slid out cleanly. He had placed it in the front slot that morning, anticipating this exact request, the way he always did when he had business in certain parts of Louisiana. He held it out. Pruitt took it, held it close to his face, read it slowly, once, then again. "This expired." "No, sir, it is valid." Pruitt pocketed the license. "I'll hold on to this while we verify you're supposed to be here." Walter's pulse did what it always did in these moments. It quickened. Not because he was afraid, not exactly, but because his body had its own memory, its own archive of 75 years of human behavior, and it knew what was happening even when his mind was still trying to respond with grace. His voice stayed level. "Officer, I need that license for check-in at the clerk's office upstairs. It is required for the hearing record." Pruitt stepped closer, close enough that Walter could smell coffee on his breath and something sour underneath it. "What you need," Pruitt said slowly, "is to watch your tone with me. I'm the one who decides what you need. Understand?" Walter understood. He always understood, which was the particular cruelty of it. He understood the entire transaction, the power, the humiliation being offered, the fact that the correct response, the safe response, the one most likely to get him into that courtroom, was to accept the humiliation quietly and wait for it to pass. He apologized. Said he had not meant to seem disrespectful. The words tasted the way they always tasted, like ash, like 40 years of ash. But Walter Gaines had swallowed worse and kept walking, and he was not going to stop now. Pruitt smiled, not a kind smile. "That is better. Now you stand right here while I make some calls. Do not move." Walter stood. His lower back ached from the old injury, the one that had come from a fall in 1998 when he had been deposed in a hostile environment and someone had left a cord across the floor. His arthritis flared in both knees with the particular sharpness of a humid morning. He stood straight anyway, satchel at his side, and waited. What Pruitt did not see was the watch on Walter's left wrist. A 1972 Omega Constellation, his father's passed down with the instruction that a black man walking into rooms where his presence is questioned needs something on his wrist that answers back quietly. The watch was partially covered by the cuff of his Oxford shirt. Pruitt never looked at it. Never. What Pruitt did not see was the monogram on the satchel, WJG Walter James Gaines. The Roman numeral was there too small near the buckle. The third, because Walter's grandfather had been a Pullman porter who saved enough to send his son to Xavier University, and that son had become the first black certified public accountant in Caldwell Parish, and Walter had inherited both the profession and the expectation of quiet dignity in the face of systems that preferred he not exist in them. What Pruitt did not notice was the phone in Walter's jacket pocket, its screen lit with a notification. "On the ground in Baton Rouge, 2 hours out. Do not move without me." Walter had not moved. He had simply reached down to retrieve his satchel from where he had set it on the steps beside him, reaching for his own property. His own documents, the 2 folders with the building code and the zoning variants and the photographs, the evidence that would end this nuisance ordinance in 20 minutes of actual legal argument. The slap came like something that had been waiting. Pruitt's open palm connected with the left side of Walter's face with a sound that carried across the entire Courthouse plaza. Walter's head snapped sideways. His glasses flew from his face. The world blurred into shapes and light, and the copper taste of blood filled his mouth instantly. "Do not you reach for anything without my permission." Pruitt grabbed Walter's shoulder and shoved him backward. Walter stumbled, caught himself against the marble railing with both hands, steadied himself. His satchel tumbled down 3 steps. The buckle caught on the edge of the second step and snapped open. Papers cascaded out, catching the morning air, spreading across the warm marble in a slow, terrible arc. Building code documents. Zoning variance records. Photographs with timestamps. A signed inspector's statement. Small claims court forms. The mundane, careful, organized paperwork of a man who had come to fight a parking ordinance and win. And one other document. Thicker paper, embossed letterhead at the top. It caught the edge of the breeze differently than the others, sliding down 3 more steps and pressing itself against the concrete planter at the bottom where Deshaun Mobley across the street could see it in his phone's camera frame. United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Pruitt kicked the satchel. It skidded further. "You got till I count to 10. Then I am adding trespassing." Blood ran warm from Walter's lip. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth, looked at the blood on his fingertips. The copper taste was thick now. His hands shook as he knelt on the steps and began gathering his papers. Not from fear, from something harder and hotter and much older than fear. 68 years of this. 68 years of being handed the bill for someone else's smallness. Of walking into rooms where the air changed when he entered it, of dressing carefully and speaking precisely and carrying every credential he had ever earned in plain sight and still being met with this exact transaction, this exact moment of a man with a badge and a looseness about him and a history of no consequences deciding that Walter Gaines needed to be reminded of something. But rage without strategy. Ruth had told him once during their first year of marriage when he had come home from a deposition, shaking with fury. Rage without strategy is just noise. It does not change anything. It just makes them comfortable. Their son Darius, she had said on another occasion years later, would be better at this than either of us. She had been right about most things. She had been right about this. Walter gathered his papers with methodical care, tapped them into alignment, slid them back into the satchel. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He straightened his jacket, and walked down the remaining steps toward the parking lot without looking back at Pruitt. I got to his car. A 2017 Ford Fusion Silver, unremarkable, except for the 2-lane law guest faculty parking permit on the dashboard. His daughter Elaine taught constitutional law there. The permit was hers. Walter used it sometimes when he visited campus and then forgot to leave it home. He sat behind the wheel. The leather was warm from the morning sun. He pulled a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and pressed it to his lip. His hands had stopped shaking by the time he unlocked his phone. I'm at one call. Marcus, change of plans. Come to the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Station instead of the courthouse. A pause. Yes, it happened. Another pause longer. But son, this time we are ready. He ended the call, sat for a moment, looked at the handkerchief. The blood on it was already drying at the edges, the way blood does in Louisiana heat. He folded it carefully and put it back in his pocket. There was a precision to even this small act that he recognized in himself, the same precision he had brought to every brief he had ever prepared, every argument he had ever organized from the ground up, every client he had ever told to stay calm, document everything, trust the process, even when the process does not yet trust you back. The process had never been designed with him in mind. He had spent a career working within it anyway. He checked his watch. The Omega showed 9 minutes past 10. His hearing had been scheduled for 9:45. He had missed it. The clerk's office would have noted the absence. The judge would have moved to the next matter. The nuisance ordinance against Greater Mercy AM remained for now uncontested on the court's calendar. He started the car. The Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Station sat 3 blocks from the courthouse on a street that held the particular air of a commercial district that had been better in a prior decade. A bail bondsman occupied the building on one side. A check-cashing operation sat on the other, its window advertising rates that Walter could identify as predatory from across the parking lot without reading the fine print, because he had spent enough time in the rooms where those rates were signed to know what they looked like from the outside. The station itself was squat brick 1970s construction American flag, in front half a parking lot of parish vehicles. He pushed through the glass door. The air conditioning hit him immediately calibrated for the people who worked there, not for anyone coming in from outside. Fluorescent lights overhead at their particular frequency. The smell of burned coffee and industrial cleaner. Greta Sims was behind the bulletproof glass looking at her computer screen. She looked up when he approached. Her eyes moved across his face. She was trained to observe, and she observed the split lip, the blood that had dried at his collar before he pressed the handkerchief to it, the quality of the shirt, the posture of a man who, despite everything, was standing straight at her window. She slid a form under the glass without being asked. The word alleged was already in the incident description field. Walter looked at the form, looked at Greta Sims. He said nothing. He picked up the pen chained to the counter and filled out the form with the same handwriting he had used for 40 years of legal documents. Every field complete, every word precise. Badge number 3847 because he had committed it to memory before Officer Dale Pruitt had gotten 3 sentences into their conversation, because this was something Walter James Gaines had learned to do so long ago that it was no longer a conscious act. I was still writing when the door behind the glass opened. Sheriff Conrad Holt had the build of a man who had been a serious college athlete and had spent the 30 years since then allowing that foundation to become something else, something that registered in rooms, not as fitness, but as mass and authority. 6'3", 240, with the particular walk of someone who has never once been uncertain about whether he belongs in a room. Campaign photographs on the wall behind the desk. Holt at a hard hat groundbreaking. Holt shaking hands with a state senator. Holt at the Rotary Club gala face arranged in the specific smile of a man who has practiced smiling as a professional skill. He came through the door with the controlled warmth of someone who had been managing problems for a long time and was very good at reading in the first 3 seconds of any encounter what kind of problem he was looking at. He looked at Walter. He read him in 3 seconds. Mr. Gaines. His voice was practiced warm without being excessive. I understand there has been some confusion this morning. Walter set down the pen. No confusion, Sheriff. One of your officers assaulted me on the courthouse steps in front of witnesses. I am here to file a formal complaint. Holt moved to the counter. Not aggressively. With the casual ease of a large man who has never had to think about the effect of his size in a small space, because the effect has always been in his favor. Officer Pruitt is one of our most experienced deputies, Holt said. 12 years of service. 3 commendations for excellence. Sometimes field interactions can be misread, especially when people come in already upset or feeling that they have not been treated respectfully. I am neither upset nor misreading, Walter said. I am reporting a crime. Holt studied him for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating his approach. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded form. The folds were sharp and practiced the way something is when it has been folded and unfolded many times because it is produced from that pocket often. He placed it on the counter. What I am offering here. Holt said, his voice dropping just slightly into the register of a confidential conversation between reasonable people, is a resolution. Officer Pruitt will issue a formal written apology. The incident is documented as a misunderstanding between 2 parties. You go home. We avoid a lengthy and expensive process that rarely produces good outcomes for anyone involved. The form's header read Voluntary Resolution Agreement. Walter picked it up. He read it the way he had always read documents, quickly, completely in order, with particular attention to what the language was designed to make invisible. Walter picked it up. Read it. His eyes moved through the first paragraph, the second, the third. Stopped at paragraph 4. Buried inside a clause about mutual non-disparagement was a waiver. Comprehensive, clean, legally tight. By signing, Walter would forfeit his right to file criminal charges, pursue civil litigation, or make any public statement about the incident. He set the form down. I decline. Holt's warmth did not disappear. It simply became something else, something colder wearing the same face. Then I think you are wasting everyone's time, Mr. Gaines. He straightened to his full height. Greta, please show Mr. Gaines out. Walter left. But his phone had been recording in his jacket pocket since the moment he walked through the door. Virginia was a one-party state. Louisiana was a one-party state. Walter Gaines had practiced law in Louisiana for 34 years, and he knew exactly what he could record when and why. He had started the recording before he got out of the car. Across town, while Walter sat in the church parking lot, waiting for a phone call that had not come yet, something else was already happening. Deshaun Mobley had walked the rest of the way to the corner store, bought a bottle of water he did not drink, walked back home and sat on the edge of his bed for 11 minutes trying to decide. He was 17. He was not naive about what the world did sometimes to black teenagers who stepped into the space between a story and its consequences. He knew what happened. He had seen it happen to people older and more prepared than him. He had also seen what happened when nobody said anything, and the story disappeared into the particular silence that descends when no one is watching and no one is recording, and everyone agrees without quite saying so that certain things are better left where they fell. He looked at the footage on his phone, watched it once, then again. The old man in the pressed shirt. The hand coming down. The papers scattering. The cop standing over him while 3 others watched from the shade. I posted it. The caption was 3 words. This is Caldwell. By 10 in the morning, it had 12,000 views. By noon, it had crossed at 41,000 and was climbing. The comment section moved the way. Comment sections move when something breaks through the membrane between information and recognition. When people are not watching a story about somewhere else, but a story about somewhere they know, even if they have never been to Caldwell Parish, Louisiana in their lives. The recognition is not geographic. It is something deeper and older and more widely distributed than geography. A woman named Sandra wrote, "This is my uncle. Last summer. Different state, same steps." A man named Robert wrote, "I work for the county next to this one. I know this officer by reputation. I know those steps. I have walked up them myself, holding my breath." A retired teacher from outside Dallas wrote, "I am 63 years old, and I have never once reached into a bag in public without first deciding whether my reaching was something someone with a badge might decide to have an opinion about. I stopped doing it. That is what this costs, and nobody ever talks about that." The comments kept coming. An assignment editor at KPLT, the local news station, saw the video when her intern flagged it. She had the instincts that assignment editors develop from years of sorting signal from noise, and she recognized the signal in this one immediately. She sent a crew. They arrived at the Courthouse Plaza within 20 minutes of the video going live. Renata Cross had been in the courthouse that morning. She was a public defender, 41 years old, with an office on the 2nd floor that overlooked the front plaza through a tall window she kept open in reasonable weather because the building's air conditioning was calibrated for the comfort of people who worked there all day, and not for anyone who came in from outside. She had been sitting at her desk reviewing case files at 9:38 when she heard the sound. She had looked up. She had seen the window. She had crossed to it in 4 steps. She had seen Dale Pruitt's hand come down. She had seen Walter's head snap sideways. She had seen him go to his knees. She had seen the papers scatter and Pruitt kick the satchel and stand over the older man with the patience of someone who has never once had to consider what standing over someone looks like to the people watching. She had pressed her hand flat against the window glass. She had filed 9 complaints against Dale Pruitt in 6 years. Not rumor, not impression. Documented complaints with attached evidence. Body cam transcripts, medical records, witness statements, and in 2 cases, her own sworn declaration as a direct witness. Excessive force during arrests of her clients. Racially coded language captured on audio. A warrantless search that a trial judge had called procedurally irregular in open court, but had ultimately declined to suppress because the evidence recovered was otherwise admissible, and the judge was not in the business of disciplining officers through suppression rulings. 9 complaints, each one filed properly through proper channels with proper documentation. Every single one had been dismissed. She had the dismissal letters in a drawer in her office. 9 of them. Each one brief, each one citing insufficient evidence or no violation of department policy or the familiar language of institutional review that said, in the particular grammar of institutional self-protection, that the matter had been examined and found to not rise to the level of required action. She had kept the letters because she believed in documentation the way her clients needed her to believe in documentation as both a professional practice and an act of faith that records matter even when no one is currently looking at them. Someone was looking now. She went down the stairs and out the front door and walked directly to the KPLT news crew that had set up on the Courthouse Plaza, their camera already rolling. The reporter adjusting her earpiece in the morning heat, Renata Cross looked into the camera and said what she had been saying and writing for 6 years to people who had received her words and filed them into the same drawer where things go that no one intends to act on. "This is not an incident," she said. "This is a pattern. I have 9 documented complaints against this officer. I have 9 dismissal letters. I have the full record. And today, for the first time, I have something I have never had in 6 years of trying to hold this department accountable." The reporter asked, "What is that?" Renata Cross said, "A witness." She meant herself. She meant Deshaun Mobley. She meant the 4 camera angles that the courthouse security system had captured. She meant the body cam that a distracted officer had forgotten to disable. She did not yet know about Marcus Gaines and his team waiting in Baton Rouge. But she was about to. In the break room at the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Station, Dale Pruitt scrolled through his phone while 3 colleagues offered variations of the same thing. Smooth work. That old man did not know who he was dealing with. You handled it right. One of them a deputy named Garrett, who had been on the force for 8 years, and had learned early that the path of least friction in this department ran alongside Pruitt and not against him, clapped him on the shoulder. Pruitt accepted the gesture the way a man accepts applause he feels he has earned. I was not worried. He had never had a reason to be worried that lasted longer than a few days, and those few days always ended the same way, with the same assurance arriving from the same direction. Commissioner Boyd Strickland had already texted him. Strickland had served on the Caldwell Parish Commission for 16 years, currently in his 4th term, and had never once lost a re-election campaign by fewer than 14 percentage points. He was the kind of political figure who built his power not through charisma, but through the patient, systematic cultivation of mutual obligation. He knew who owed him. He knew what they owed. And he kept those debts current the way a good accountant keeps ledgers current, with attention and with the understanding that the value of a debt is in the collecting. Strickland was the reason Pruitt's 4 prior complaints had been reviewed by boards whose members Strickland had personally recommended to the sheriff for appointment. He was the reason the parish attorney's civil settlements had come packaged with confidentiality clauses that made the complaints functionally invisible in any future review. He was the reason Dale Pruitt had lasted 12 years in a role that his conduct should have ended within the first 4. The text said, "Heard about the courthouse. Do not sweat it, son. I will handle it. This blows over by the weekend. Son." Strickland always called him son. Not because there was any actual paternal relationship, but because it was the kind of word that created the feeling of one, and Strickland had always understood that the feeling of protection was often more powerful than its substance. Pruitt read the text, closed his phone, took a long sip of his coffee, which had gone cold, but which he drank anyway because he was not the kind of man who let small inconveniences register. I was untouchable. He always had been. He had no reason to think today was different from any other day. Walter sat in a pew at Greater Mercy AM Church that afternoon and let the building be quiet around him. The church on Monroe and 5th was built in 1889 according to the bronze plaque beside the front door. Built by the congregation of freed men and women who had arrived in Caldwell Parish after the war with nothing except what they carried in their bodies and their faith and their determination to construct something that could not be taken from them. The building had survived a fire in 1923 that took the bell tower. It had survived a flood in 1952 that left watermarks still visible behind the choir loft if you knew where to look. It had survived the particular institutional pressure that had been applied to it in recent years through nuisance ordinances and denied building permits, and the calculated inconvenience of a parish government that would have preferred the block for other purposes. It smelled the way old churches smell wood, warmed by generations of presence. Candle wax, the particular layered scent of a space that has held joy and grief and everything between them for a very long time. Walter had not been in this sanctuary since Ruth's funeral. He had stood at this same spot in the front row on the left side and listened to Reverend Tate speak about Ruth, and had spent the entire service focusing on the grain of the wood in the pew in front of him, because he had discovered that if he focused on something specific and physical, he could remain standing, and remaining standing had felt that day like the only thing required of him. He sat now in the same spot, the same pew, the same afternoon light coming through the colored glass of the side windows, falling across the floor in red and amber and the particular shade of blue that Ruth had always said looked like the inside of a prayer. Reverend Tate came and sat beside him without saying anything for a while. Tate was 71 and had the patience of a man who had spent 50 years learning that the things people needed to say usually found their own way to the surface when you did not rush them. After several minutes, Walter reached into his satchel. He pulled out 2 items and held them in his lap. The first was the sealed birthday card for Marcus, slightly bent at the lower right corner from the fall on the steps. Still the proudest thing I ever did. He had written it the night before, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea going cold beside him, and he had meant every word of it with the simple, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had lived long enough to know what he was proud of. The second was a document on thick paper, embossed letterhead, his own handwriting in the body of it neat and precise, describing in plain language what had happened on the courthouse steps at 9:41 in the morning. He had written it in the parking lot of the sheriff's station immediately after being shown out. He had dated it, signed it, photographed it with his phone, and sent the photograph to Marcus, to his former law partner Claudette Marsh, and to his personal email as a time-stamped backup. I was a man who kept receipts. Tate looked at the document, then at Walter. His eyes moved to the split lip, the dried blood at the collar. "What happens next?" Tate asked. Walter placed the document back in the satchel, folded his hands in his lap, looked at the colored light on the floor. "My son," he said, "is better at this than I am." 6 weeks earlier, in the New Orleans field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Gaines had been sitting at a desk that was covered in organized chaos. Stacked binders, printed spreadsheets, a whiteboard on the wall with a timeline stretching across it in blue marker, 47 documented incidents. Each one a data point in a pattern that had been building for years without anyone with sufficient authority choosing to look at it directly. The binder on top was labeled Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office Pattern and Practice Investigation Open Case. Marcus had spent 14 months building it. 14 months of subpoenaed records and FOIA requests and interviews with residents who were willing to speak and residents who were not willing yet, and residents who had given up on the idea that speaking would change anything. 14 months of cross-referencing incident reports against complaint records, of tracing financial flows through department budget documents, of building the kind of evidentiary architecture that federal cases require before they can stand up to the particular scrutiny that institutional defendants bring to the process of denying what the records show. He had assembled through this process a picture, not a dramatic picture, not the kind of thing that announced itself with sirens. A quiet picture built from numbers and dates and names and the repeated appearance of certain patterns across time. The kind of picture that is harder to look at than a dramatic one, because it does not permit the comfortable response of calling it an exception. I was 41 years old, 2 months shy of 42. The Bureau had recruited him in his late 20s after his time as a public defender in New Orleans, where he had spent 4 years defending clients with the growing conviction that the problems his clients faced were not best addressed one client at a time. The problems were structural. They required a structural response. Federal pattern and practice law was one of the few instruments available for that response, and Marcus had spent 15 years learning to use it with the precision that his father had spent 34 years using the civil courts. I had his mother's sense of justice. Ruth had not been a lawyer. She had been a middle school librarian for 32 years, and she had known when something was wrong the way a compass knows north without calculation, without deliberation, with the simple certainty of a thing that is designed for a specific direction. It was not an emotion for her. It was a fact. Something was wrong or it was not. If it was, the question was what to do about it. I had his father's patience. 40 years of watching Walter Gaines approach the most inflamed and difficult situations with the particular calm of a man who had decided long ago that his emotion was a resource to be deployed strategically, not a reaction to be performed. Take your time. Read the document. Let the other side move first. Wait for the moment when the evidence is not just sufficient but undeniable. The Caldwell Parish case was close to that moment. 47 documented incidents, 89% involving black residents. Pruitt in 14 of them, a 100% complaint dismissal rate. Close, but not yet there in the way that federal cases needed to be there. Marcus needed an anchor. An incident with a witness whose credibility would withstand every challenge a defense attorney could construct, whose documentation was complete, whose account was supported by independent evidence, who would sit in a federal proceeding and be simply unshakably themselves. His father had called 3 weeks before the courthouse hearing. "I have business at the Caldwell Parish Courthouse," Walter had said. "A church matter. You know that county." Marcus had been quiet for 6 seconds. He had counted them. Then he had said, "Do not dress down." Walter had understood. They had not discussed it further. They did not need to. Walter James Gaines had been navigating the gap between what the law said and how the law was applied in certain rooms for 34 years. He knew exactly what his son was asking. He knew exactly what it meant to dress deliberately, to carry himself, deliberately to walk up courthouse steps, deliberately knowing the profile of the man who was likely to be watching, and knowing what that profile said about how the watching was likely to go. He had made the choice with full understanding. Marcus's team had been in position since 7 that morning. 2 agents in a vehicle 2 blocks from the courthouse. A third at the coffee shop across from the plaza with a direct line of sight to the steps. Agent Lorraine Webb coordinating from the Baton Rouge field office with access to the courthouse security system through a technical warrant. The federal letterhead document in Walter's satchel was not decorative. It was a legitimate DOJ subpoena requiring the Caldwell Parish Clerk of Court to produce certain records. Walter had been asked to hand-deliver it because his name being on the delivery created a clean record of receipt independent of federal channels. The subpoena was real. The delivery was legitimate. The fact that a retired attorney carrying a federal subpoena to a courthouse would present exactly the profile that a certain kind of officer found intolerable was a calculation that both men had made with full clarity and not spoken of again. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the front doors of the Caldwell Parish Courthouse opened. Marcus Gaines walked through them. "I wore a charcoal suit that fit the way suits fit when a man takes his measurements seriously." His FBI credentials hung from his belt on a clip gold shield, catching the afternoon light in a way that registered before any words were spoken. Behind him walked 2 agents in tactical vests, dark navy with yellow FBI lettering visible across the chest. They carried document cases. They moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been briefed on exactly what they were walking into and had no uncertainty about their role. The lobby was not empty. There were lawyers with briefcases, court clerks moving between desks, a few citizens waiting on plastic chairs, a bailiff standing near the metal detector. All of them registered the entrance the way people register something that changes the temperature of a room without understanding immediately why the temperature changed. Dale Pruitt was standing near the stairwell back on courthouse duty after his shift at the station. He saw them from 30 feet away. His face moved through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. The first was the automatic assessment of law enforcement cataloging the new people entering his space. The second was something that might have been confusion. The third was something he had never quite felt before, and he did not have a name for it yet. Marcus did not look at Pruitt first. I went directly to his father. Walter was sitting on a wooden bench near the clerk's window where a court officer had told him to wait after his hearing had been postponed. The judge's clerk had cited scheduling conflicts upon seeing Walter's bruised face. Walter had understood what scheduling conflicts meant in that context. Marcus crossed the lobby in 12 steps. He stopped in front of his father, looked at the split lip, the dried blood at the collar, the set of his father's jaw. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and produced a folded handkerchief, clean and pressed, and held it out. Walter took it, pressed it to his lip. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Marcus turned. The lobby had gone quiet the way lobbies do not ordinarily go quiet. Not empty, but still. People had stopped pretending to do other things. Renata Cross was there. She had come back for an afternoon client, and she had seen the FBI agents come through the door, and she stood near the staircase with her fingers pressed to her mouth, watching. Marcus walked toward Pruitt with a measured pace that covered the 30 feet in what felt like a very long time. "Officer Dale Pruitt," he said. His voice carried without being raised. "I am Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Gaines, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are the subject of an active federal civil rights investigation under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. You are not under arrest at this moment. You are required to remain." Pruitt's jaw worked. His body language tried to assemble itself into the shape of confidence and produced something that looked more like a man trying to remember what confidence looked like. "I was performing my lawful duties," Pruitt said. That man was loitering on public property. When I attempted to verify his reason for being there, he became aggressive. Marcus pulled out a tablet, pressed 2 buttons. "Is this you in this video?" He held the screen toward Pruitt. Deshaun Mobley's footage played. The image was clear shot from across the street with the kind of camera clarity that modern phones provide even under midday glare. No audio, but none was needed. The footage showed Walter standing calmly. It showed Pruitt approaching. It showed the conversation. It showed Walter reaching for his satchel. It showed Pruitt's hand. It showed the moment Walter's head snapped sideways. Pruitt's expression cracked. Not collapsed, not yet. But the certainty that had lived in his face all morning began to fracture at its seams. "That video does not show the full context," he said. Agent Lorraine Webb, Marcus's second, stepped forward. "We also have courthouse security footage," she said. 4 different cameras. 2 of them include audio. She held up her own tablet and swiped to a different video. The angle was elevated, looking down at the full scope of the plaza. It captured the entire interaction from beginning to end. Additionally, Agent Webb continued, "Your body camera was active during this incident. You forgot to disable it." The color left Pruitt's face the way color leaves something when the heat underneath it is removed. He had disabled his body cam before confrontations for years. It was not a conscious thought anymore. It was muscle memory. Come out of the car, take a quick second, disable the cam. File a malfunction report later. Holt's guidance on that had been issued in writing to the entire department through an internal memo that said, "Camera malfunctions happen. Do not stress. If equipment fails in high-tension situations, file a malfunction report after your shift. We will handle it." The memo was unsigned. It had been distributed via the department's internal server. The department server that Marcus's team had subpoenaed. But this morning, Pruitt had been distracted. Distracted by his coffee, which had gone cold, and by the particular irritation he had felt seeing a well-dressed black man in a pressed Oxford shirt climbing the courthouse steps with the bearing of someone who was entirely certain he had a right to be there, he had forgotten. Marcus continued in the same level tone that had not changed since he walked through the door. "Officer Pruitt, you are not under arrest at this moment. You do have the right to remain silent and the right to consult with an attorney before answering any questions. I advise you to exercise both of those rights immediately. Anything you say from this point forward can and will be used in federal criminal and civil proceedings." "Criminal," Pruitt said. His voice was different now, smaller. The doors at the far end of the lobby crashed open. Sheriff Conrad Holt came through them with the energy of a man who had been called with news he did not like and had covered the 3 blocks from the station at a pace his body had not attempted in some time. His face was flushed. His uniform was immaculate because Holt was the kind of man who never let his uniform show what his face was showing. "What the hell is this?" Holt demanded, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to having his question be the last question asked in any room. "You cannot come into my county and my courthouse and conduct some kind of federal circus without informing my office." Marcus turned to face him. He reached into the document case his agent had been carrying and produced a sealed envelope. "Sheriff Holt." He handed it over. "Your office was notified via certified mail this morning. You will find confirmation of delivery in that envelope along with a federal subpoena, demanding all personnel files, arrest records, use of force incident reports, body cam footage, internal complaint, documentation, financial records, including asset forfeiture reporting, and all internal communications related to officer discipline for the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office covering the last 6 years. Holt's hands were steady as he took the envelope, but something in his posture changed. Something shifted behind his eyes. He was a pragmatic man. He had kept his operation running for 16 years through a combination of genuine political skill, Strickland's patronage, and the careful management of information. He recognized in the weight and precision of the document in his hands something he had never quite faced before. Walter had risen from the bench. He walked across the lobby with the deliberate pace of a man whose knees ached and who was choosing not to show it. He stopped beside Marcus. He placed a document on the clerk's window counter. "This," Walter said, his voice quiet and even as a DOJ subpoena. "I was hand-delivering to the clerk of court this morning when Officer Pruitt stopped me. It requests the same records your son is describing filed through a separate channel before the incident on the steps." Both requests were filed independently and simultaneously. Holt looked at the document, looked at Marcus, looked at Walter. The lobby held its silence. Marcus spoke to the room, not to Holt alone, to everyone present, because what he was saying needed to be heard by more than one person. "Caldwell Parish has arrested black residents at 4.3 times the rate of white residents for identical offenses over the last 6 years. Officer Pruitt appears in 14 of the 47 documented use of force incidents in that period. Your office dismissed 100% of the excessive force complaints received during that time. 100%. Including 9 complaints filed by the Public Defender's Office, each one supported by documented evidence." He paused. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is a record." Walter looked at Pruitt. He had not looked directly at him since crossing the lobby. He looked at him now with the full steadiness of a man who has nothing left to prove and knows it. "You saw a black man in a pressed shirt climbing the courthouse steps," Walter said, "and you could not help yourself. You needed to remind him of his place." He paused for only a moment. "I was counting on that." Pruitt opened his mouth, Nothing came out. Across the lobby, Deputy Lena Fordham had been standing near the main security desk watching. She was 34 years old, 5 years on the Caldwell Parish Force, and she had been standing under the colonnade that morning when Pruitt's hand came down. She had been 6 feet away. She had seen it happen the way you see something happen when it is close enough to feel when the sound of it reaches you before your mind has processed what your eyes observed. She had not intervened. She had gone back inside the courthouse. She had walked back to her post. She had sat at her desk and opened her case notes and typed for 40 minutes with her hands not entirely steady on the keyboard, while something settled into her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She recognized it, though. It was the weight of a choice that had not been fully made yet, but was making itself regardless the way certain choices make themselves whether you participate in the decision or not. She had told herself the things she had been telling herself for 5 years, that it was not her place, that her position was not secure enough to withstand the particular kind of scrutiny that came with being the person who broke ranks. That she had tried twice to route concerns through proper channels, and the channels had led nowhere, and she had learned from the experience that the channels were designed to lead nowhere, that there was always a reason. She had watched 9 of Renata Cross's complaints disappear. She had not filed any of them herself, but she had known about them, and she had known why they disappeared, and she had chosen to know that quietly and privately, and not in ways that required anything of her. 5 years of that. She stood near the security desk in the courthouse lobby and looked at the FBI agents with their document cases and their body cam footage playing on a tablet. She looked at Walter Gaines, 68 years old, blood dried at his collar, standing beside his son with the steadiness of a man who had made his choice a long time ago and was simply living it forward. She looked at Dale Pruitt, flanked by agents, his certainty finally and completely gone. She looked at Holt, who was holding the federal subpoena, and whose face was the face of a man watching something he had built become something he could no longer manage. She made her choice. She stepped forward. Agent Gaines. Her voice was not entirely steady. She was aware of it. She made herself keep going anyway. I was present on the courthouse steps this morning. I witnessed the incident. She stopped. Then I can also provide testimony regarding prior incidents that were not properly documented or reported through official channels. An agent was beside her with a tablet before she finished speaking. Holt turned toward her. The look he gave her was not angry. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man registering for the first time in 16 years that he had misjudged something. Fordham did not look at him. She gave her statement to the tablet. She was methodical and precise, and she did not rush. She described what she had seen that morning. She described 2 prior incidents she had witnessed and not reported. She described the conversation she had overheard at the station the previous year when Pruitt and a deputy named Garrett had discussed without apparent concern about being heard how to characterize a search that both of them knew had been conducted without proper consent. She described the instruction she had received secondhand from a senior deputy about which complaint forms needed supervisory signature before submission and which did not, and how that distinction was applied in practice. She described 6 years of the thing that had no official name, but that everyone on the force understood the expected silence of people who wanted to keep their jobs. Commissioner Boyd Strickland arrived 14 minutes later. He came through the courthouse doors with the particular energy of a man who had spent 16 years believing that his arrival in a situation was itself a kind of management tool. He had driven over from his commission office when the call came, had told his assistant he would be back in an hour, had walked into the courthouse lobby with the expression of a man who intended to have a brief conversation with the federal agents and leave with the situation redirected. He walked into the middle of Fordham's statement. He saw the tablet recording her words. He saw Pruitt standing flanked the body cam footage visible on another screen. He saw the document cases the agent's Walter standing beside Marcus the subpoena in Holt's hands. His political instincts, which were genuinely excellent, fired immediately and produced a single output. He turned around. I was on his phone before he reached the parking lot, and the call he was making was not to anyone who could help Dale Pruitt. It was to his own attorney, whose home number he had kept in his contacts for the last 8 years for exactly the kind of moment that required a call before the moment became something you could not call ahead of. He turned around, walked back through the doors without saying a word. I was on his phone before he reached the parking lot, but the call he was making was to his attorney, not to anyone who could help Dale Pruitt. In the weeks that followed, the case moved through its institutional architecture, the way federal cases move when they have been thoroughly prepared before they are filed. Not fast the way dramatic things in movies move fast. Fast the way pressure moves through a structure when the structure has no more tolerance for it. The meeting in Baton Rouge took place in a federal building on the 6th floor with windows that looked out over a river going silver in the afternoon light. U.S. Attorney Patricia Wynn entered first. She had prosecuted police departments in 3 states. She had secured consent decrees in jurisdictions that had fought them all the way to appeals courts and lost. Her reputation was built on 2 things: thorough preparation and an absolute absence of interest in what was politically convenient for the people across the table from her. She opened without pleasantries. "Gentlemen," she said, looking at Holt and the parish attorney, and the space where Strickland's attorney now sat in Strickland's place. "We are here because the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office has been operating in documented violation of the civil rights of its residents for a minimum of 6 years. Our investigation is comprehensive. The evidence is not in dispute. What is in dispute is how you choose to respond to it, and your options are narrowing by the day." She activated the projector. The first slide was a simple bar graph. Arrest rates by race, Caldwell Parish, 6-year period. The disparity was not subtle. It was not the kind of thing that required interpretation or contextualization. It was a disparity that once seen occupied the space where innocent explanations used to live and refused to leave room for them. The parish attorney looked at the bar graph and then looked at his hands on the table. The second slide showed use of force incidents broken down by the race of the subject involved. The bars were similarly unambiguous. The third slide showed internal complaint records, filed complaints, review outcomes, dismissal rates. That slide showed a single bar at 100% for the dismissal column because that was the number. 100%. Over 6 years, for every complaint. The fourth slide showed asset forfeiture data. Boyd Strickland's attorney, a careful man named Lewis Greer, who had spent 20 years practicing municipal defense, and who could read a slide faster than most people read a sentence, looked at the fourth slide and quietly closed his folder and slid it an inch to his left, creating the small physical distance of a man who had just decided not to be associated with its contents. Walter stood from his seat near the back of the room and walked forward. He placed 2 documents on the table side by side with the deliberate alignment of a man who had spent 34 years presenting evidence to people who were paid to scrutinize it. "This is the Caldwell Parish Official Asset Forfeiture Audit for the period in question," he said. He indicated the left document. "This is the internal spreadsheet subpoenaed from the department server." He indicated the right one. The room read the numbers. The official audit reported one figure. The internal spreadsheet reported a figure that was $340,000 larger. "That is not a clerical error," Walter said. His voice carried the particular calm authority of a man who had spent 34 years explaining financial discrepancies to courts. "That is embezzlement. Specifically, since several of these seizures involved federally insured accounts, it also implicates wire fraud. And since the funds were moved through multiple accounts to obscure their origin, it adds money laundering." The parish attorney's face had gone the color of old wax. He had not known these numbers. Holt had told him specifically and on more than one occasion that the forfeiture program was standard practice reviewed annually, compliant with state law clean. He had accepted that assurance because accepting it had been easy and comfortable and because he had not gone looking for a reason to question it. I was looking at a reason now. Commissioner Strickland's attorney cleared his throat and said his client had no knowledge of any accounting irregularities and wished to cooperate fully with any federal inquiry. Marcus said, Commissioner Strickland's nephew owns the towing company that has held the exclusive impound contract with the Caldwell Parish Sheriff's Office for 9 years. In that time, towing and impound fees generated from stops made by department officers totaled approximately $800,000, of which the towing company retained 60%. Financial records show $70,000 in payments from the towing company to a shell company whose registered agent is a member of Commissioner Strickland's immediate family. He paused. Let those numbers land. These are not allegations, Marcus said. These are documented financial records. Patricia Wynne addressed Holt directly. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You can sign a voluntary consent decree requiring comprehensive reform of your department's practices, federal oversight for 3 years, and full cooperation with the criminal investigation now underway. Or we proceed with a federal lawsuit naming the department, the parish, and individually named officers and officials as defendants, in which case every document in those binders becomes part of the public record by end of week, and every news organization in the state covers the filing in detail. She stood. I will give you until close of business today. She walked out. Her team followed. Walter was last. He paused at the door and looked at Holt. I wanted to contest a nuisance ordinance and go home, Walter said quietly. You made this necessary. He pulled the door closed behind him. Holt sat at the table for a long time. He looked at the consent decree. He looked at the binders his parish attorney had not opened because the parish attorney already understood that opening them would require him to know things he was not prepared to know. He looked at the 2 documents Walter had placed side by side, the official audit and the internal spreadsheet with the $340,000 discrepancy. I thought about 16 years of careful management, of knowing which calls to return and which to let go to voicemail, of understanding the particular art of keeping things from becoming too visible. He had not created the department's culture. He had inherited it and maintained it, and told himself on the occasions when maintenance required looking away, that looking away was part of the job. The 2 documents side by side on the table were not something he could look away from anymore. He signed the consent decree at 5:47 in the afternoon. His resignation letter was submitted at 5:49. The announcement was made from the steps of the Caldwell Parish Courthouse the following morning at a podium that Patricia Wynne's office had set up at precisely the spot where the marble was still faintly marked by the impact of Walter's satchel falling 7 weeks earlier. The symbolism was not accidental. Wynne had walked the steps herself the evening before, looked at the mark, and said, "Here." The crowd was larger than anyone had expected. People had come from neighboring parishes, from churches, from neighborhoods that the department had been working its way through for years. 230 people in the Louisiana morning heat, which was already significant by 9 in the morning, standing on the lawn in the plaza and spilling onto the sidewalk. Conrad Holt stood at the podium in his dress uniform for the last time. He read from a prepared statement that his attorney had reviewed 3 times, and that said what it needed to say in the careful language of legal accountability, which is a language designed to acknowledge without fully illuminating. He said he accepted responsibility for failures of oversight that allowed civil rights violations to occur under his watch. He said the county had entered a consent decree with the Department of Justice requiring comprehensive reform. He said effective immediately he was resigning as sheriff of Caldwell Parish. He did not say he was sorry. The statement had not included that word, and he had not added it. He stepped back from the podium and Patricia Wynne stepped forward. She did not bring notes. Today she said, her voice carrying across the plaza without effort, "Mark's accountability. Not just for Officer Dale Pruitt, who has been terminated and faces federal criminal charges for assault and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Not just for the deputies who enabled him, 3 of whom have been terminated following the federal review. Today marks accountability for 6 years of institutional failure that allowed those violations to continue unchecked." She paused to let that land. This investigation was built on evidence. It was built by an agent who spent 14 months compiling a record that the department could not dismiss or explain away. It was made possible by a public defender who filed 9 complaints over 6 years and kept every dismissal letter in a drawer because she believed records matter even when no one is reading them yet. It was made possible by a 17-year-old who had the presence of mind to press record when it mattered. She looked at Walter, who stood to her right with his hands folded in front of him in the ivory Oxford shirt with the cufflinks that had been a gift from his late wife after the first victory. And it was made possible, she said, by one man who understood exactly what he was walking into on these steps, and walked in anyway. The crowd applauded. The sound of it carried across the plaza and up the face of the courthouse and into the morning air over Caldwell Parish. Renata Cross was standing at the back of the crowd with her arms crossed and her fingers pressed to her eyes. She stood like that for a moment. Then she lowered her hands. She thought about 9 complaints. 9 pieces of paper that she had prepared with the same care she brought to every document, because she was the kind of lawyer who believed that the care you bring to a document reflects the respect you have for the person whose story it tells. She thought about the 9 people who had sat across her desk and told her what had happened to them, and asked her in various ways and with various amounts of hope left whether filing a complaint would do any good. She had told them she would try. She had believed it when she said it. She still believed it now, even knowing what the trying had produced, because the alternative to trying was something she refused to become. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, straightened her jacket. Today someone had listened, not because the 9th complaint was somehow more compelling than the first 8. Not because the system had corrected itself. Because Marcus Gaines had spent 14 months building a case that the system could not absorb and dismiss, and because Walter Gaines had walked up those steps, knowing what was likely to happen and let it happen in front of every camera that his son had positioned to capture it. The system had not fixed itself. The system had been fixed from outside. That distinction mattered. Renata Cross knew it mattered. She intended to spend the rest of her career explaining exactly why it mattered and what it meant for the work of the people who were trying to make the fixing happen from inside. In the house across the city, Dale Pruitt watched the press conference on the television. He sat in the living room in a chair he had owned for 11 years in the house. He had owned for 11 years, looking at a screen that was showing him the consequences of a morning that had felt at the time like every other morning of those 11 years. His wife had left 9 days ago. She had not called since arriving at her mother's house in Natchitoches. She had taken their daughter, who was 7 and who Pruitt had not spoken to in 9 days and who would at some point need to be told something about why her father's face was on the news. He did not know yet what that something would be. His union representative had delivered the decision 3 days earlier. Too much footage. Too much public attention. Too significant a case for the union to absorb the reputational cost of a vigorous defense. The representative had been apologetic in the practiced way of someone delivering a message they had delivered before with just enough personal warmth to be human and just enough professional distance to be clear. Pruitt was on his own. Commissioner Strickland had not returned his last 4 calls. The political distance Strickland was creating between himself and Dale Pruitt was comprehensive and moving quickly. Strickland understood with the instincts of a man who had survived 3 prior scandals by correctly identifying the moment when a problem stopped being manageable and became existential. That he was now at that moment, and that the only viable path through it ran as far away from Pruitt as the geography of their connection would allow. Pruitt turned off the television. He sat in the quiet living room and did the thing he had never really had to do before he tried to find the internal logic that had always, in every prior situation, provided him with a version of events he could live with. He looked for the architecture of justification that had kept him standing upright through 4 prior complaints, 2 civil suits, and a decade of incidents that had produced nothing except Strickland's texts and his colleagues' approval. He could not find it. The footage was there. 3 independent sources. His own body cam. All of them showing the same thing. An elderly man reaching for his own bag. The architecture was gone. She did not try to stop the tears. Deshaun Mobley watched the press conference on his phone, standing in his kitchen because his mother had said he should see it since he was part of it. He watched Wynn speak. He watched the part where she mentioned the footage and said a community member had the presence of mind to document what the department's own body cams should have documented. She did not say his name. He was a minor and his identity was protected, but he knew who she meant. He set his phone down on the kitchen counter. His mother put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You did something." He nodded. He did not have words for it yet. He was 17. Words for some things take time to form. On the other side of the city, in the house he had lived in for 11 years, Dale Pruitt watched the press conference on the television in his living room. The room felt different than it had 7 weeks ago. His wife had taken their daughter to her mother's house in Natchitoches the week before, after the federal charges were announced. His union representative had called 3 days ago with a message that could be summarized simply: too much evidence, too much footage, too much visibility. They would not fund his legal defense. I was on his own. His phone was on the coffee table. Boyd Strickland had not returned his last 4 calls. Commissioner Strickland was at that moment meeting with his own attorney in a private office in Baton Rouge, discussing the specific language of a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. His nephew's towing company had already suspended operations pending a federal audit. The political distance Strickland was creating between himself and Dale Pruitt was thorough and moving quickly. Pruitt turned off the television. He sat in the quiet of his living room for a long time. He thought about the morning on the courthouse steps. He tried to reconstruct the logic of it the way he had reconstructed the logic of every prior complaint, every prior accusation, every moment when someone had said this was wrong, and he had found the internal architecture of justification that made it something else. The man was loitering. The man was suspicious. The man was being aggressive. The man did not comply in the way that compliance was expected, but the footage was there. All 3 sources. And the footage did not show a man who was aggressive or suspicious or failing to comply. The footage showed an elderly man in a pressed shirt reaching for his own bag. He had no architecture left. Dale Pruitt was convicted in federal court on 2 counts. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Assault on a federal court proceeding participant. The sentencing took place 6 weeks after conviction. The federal judge, a woman named Honorable Frances Doyle, who had presided over 3 prior police misconduct cases in the Eastern District, imposed a sentence of 7 years. She was clear and she was brief. A badge is not a license, and the law applies to those who enforce it with greater force than it applies to anyone else because the power differential demands it. Pruitt would be 66 when he completed his sentence. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He would never carry a badge again. Walter Gaines filed his civil suit through his former partners at Gaines and Associates, represented by the junior partner who had taken over the firm, a woman named Claudette Marsh, whom Walter had mentored for 11 years. The civil judgment came 9 months after the criminal conviction. $1,200,000. Walter accepted the figure without celebration. He had already decided in the weeks between the courthouse confrontation and the civil filing what he intended to do with it. He directed 80% into a new legal defense fund, specifically for Caldwell Parish residents facing excessive force unlawful stops or civil asset forfeiture without recourse. He named it the Ruth Gaines Justice Fund, not after himself. After his wife, who had sat at her kitchen table making calls for the church, who had known when something was wrong the way a compass finds north, who had said their son would be better at this than either of them. Ruth had been right. The remaining 20% went toward the renovation of Greater Mercy AME's Fellowship Hall, which had a roof that had been leaking since 2019 and which the parish had denied a building permit for repairs twice in 3 years. The building permit was now approved. The renovation began on the first Monday of October. Commissioner Boyd Strickland was indicted on 4 counts of racketeering, 2 counts of bribery, and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice. The cooperation agreement he had sought from Patricia Wynn's office was offered at a significant cost. Full disclosure of every arrangement between his office and the sheriff's department going back 9 years, including the towing contract, the internal complaint dismissal process, and a separate arrangement involving a land developer who had been interested in the block where Greater Mercy AME stood. That last arrangement was the one that had initiated the nuisance ordinance against the church in the first place. Strickland accepted the cooperation agreement. He avoided prison by a margin that his attorney described as extremely close. He resigned from the commission, forfeited his county pension, and paid substantial fines. The political network he had spent 16 years constructing was by the end of that year completely dismantled. The parish attorney, Gilbert Fenn, resigned the morning Strickland's indictment was unsealed. He cited personal reasons. 3 other deputies were terminated following the federal review. 2 resigned before their terminations were finalized. Deputy Lena Fordham remained on the force under the new interim sheriff, a woman named Captain Vera James, a 20-year veteran from Shreveport, who had applied for the position the moment Holt's resignation became public. Fordham had been the only deputy on duty that morning who chose correctly when it mattered. That choice had cost her something. She knew it would. The department she came back to was smaller and more scrutinized, and the atmosphere among the remaining officers was tense in the way that an atmosphere becomes tense when people know they are being watched and are not certain anymore what the rules are. That tension was, in Fordham's view, a reasonable price for the alternative. She filed her first internal report of a potential civil rights violation 7 weeks after returning to duty. A traffic stop she had witnessed that she believed lacked probable cause. She documented it thoroughly. She submitted it through the new civilian review process. The review board investigated. The officer received a formal counseling documented in his permanent file. The process had worked the way it was supposed to work. Fordham had gone home that evening and made herself dinner and sat at her kitchen table and thought about the 9 complaints Renata Cross had filed over 6 years, and what it would have meant if even one of them had been handled this way. She thought about that for a long time. Renata Cross testified before the Federal Oversight Panel convened under the consent decree. She brought the 9 complaints with her, printed and bound each one with its original documentation and the official dismissal notice attached. She set the stack on the table in front of the panel and described each one in order. The federal judge who chaired the panel called them in her official summary a documented sequence of institutional indifference that enabled escalating misconduct over a period of 6 years. Those words entered the public record. They could not be unfiled. The reforms mandated under the consent decree took effect over a 90-day implementation period. Mandatory body cam activation triggered automatically upon vehicle exit, with real-time cloud upload that officers could not access or delete. Disabling a camera triggered an immediate supervisor alert and automatic administrative review. A public complaint portal was established online, accessible to any resident, routed directly to the Civilian Review Board rather than Internal Affairs. The Civilian Review Board had 7 members elected by parish residents with the authority to review all use of force incident subpoena records, and officers recommend binding disciplinary action and publish quarterly transparency reports. All traffic stop data was published publicly. Race of driver stated reason for stop outcome, whether a search was conducted, whether contraband was found. The data was downloadable. Researchers and journalists and residents could access it. In the first quarter after implementation, traffic stops in the parish declined by 19%. Use of force incidents declined by 31%. Civilian complaints increased because residents now had a channel that worked and they used it, but the nature of the complaints shifted. They were smaller things, resolvable things, not the kind of thing that accumulates into a pattern because no one is counting. The data told those stories. Public data on a public portal updated monthly. Marcus Gaines received a promotion to Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI New Orleans Field Office Civil Rights Division. The Caldwell Parish case became the model for a training curriculum used in 5 Southern field offices. He testified before a Senate subcommittee on police accountability, 14 months after the courthouse confrontation, citing the specific evidentiary framework his team had used and the consent decree's implementation data. I was calm and precise on the stand, the way his father was calm and precise in a courtroom. He did not overstate. He did not perform. He answered the questions he was asked and did not answer questions he was not asked. And when a senator from a state Marcus had never worked in suggested that federal intervention in local law enforcement was overreach, Marcus said, without heat, that 47 documented incidents and a 100% complaint dismissal rate represented a local failure of sufficient magnitude to require federal response, and then he cited the data and the senator did not follow up. Walter Gaines returned to the Caldwell Parish Courthouse 6 weeks after the consent decree was signed. Same steps, same morning humidity. The light fell across the marble in the same way it always did, warm and indifferent to what the marble had witnessed. The interim sheriff, Captain Vera James, held the door. Walter thanked her and went inside. In courtroom 3B, the nuisance ordinance against Greater Mercy, AME, was called at 9:45, the same time the original hearing had been scheduled. Walter set his 2 folders on the plaintiff's table. The parish presented no argument. The new parish attorney, a young woman named Deborah Haas, who had been in the job for 3 weeks, said the parish had no objection to dismissal. The judge took 4 minutes. Case dismissed. Walter gathered his folders, put them in his satchel, buckled the satchel carefully, walked out of courtroom 3B, down the corridor, down the stairs, across the lobby, through the front doors, and down the courthouse steps in the morning light. He did not stop on the steps. He walked to his car. That Sunday, Walter sat in the front pew of Greater Mercy AME for the first time since Ruth's funeral. The sanctuary was full, 300 people, the way it was always full when the community needed to be together in one room. Reverend Tate read from Joshua. He read the passage about strength and courage and not being frightened or dismayed, and his voice filled the space, the way voices built for large rooms fill them, reaching the back pew and the balcony and the high old windows with their colored glass. Walter did not speak. He was not there to speak. Marcus sat beside him. They had not been in the same room without federal business between them in 8 months. They sat together in the front pew of the church where Ruth had served as treasurer for 22 years and listened to Reverend Tate read from Joshua and did not feel the need to say anything to each other, because some things between fathers and sons do not require words. After the service, standing in the parking lot while the congregation gathered around them in the way that congregations gather after something difficult has finally resolved itself, a woman named Margaret, who had been a member of Greater Mercy for 40 years and had known Ruth since they were both young mothers, took Walter's hands in both of hers and held them for a moment. "She said Ruth would be so proud of you," Walter said she usually was. He drove home on streets that felt for the first time in a while like they were keeping some version of their promise. He had been home for an hour when he remembered the birthday card. He found it in the front pocket of the satchel where he had put it the morning he drove to the courthouse. The envelope was slightly bent at the lower right corner, creased from the day the satchel hit the marble steps and tumbled down. He smoothed the corner with his thumb. It did not fully smooth. He held the envelope for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen desk where he kept his stationery, found a pen, opened the envelope carefully, and added a line beneath what he had already written. The original line said, "Still the proudest thing I ever did." The new line said it was worth it. He sealed the envelope again, walked to the mailbox at the end of his driveway in the afternoon light, and sent it. Marcus received it at his desk in New Orleans on a Tuesday 4 days after it was mailed. He recognized his father's handwriting on the envelope before he turned it over. He opened it carefully, read both lines, sat with them for a moment. He set the card beside his keyboard, leaning it against the monitor where he would see it every morning when he sat down to work. The Caldwell Parish Civilian Review Board published its first quarterly transparency report 6 months after implementation. The data showed measurable change in traffic stop disparity, use of force rates, and complaint resolution times. The report was 42 pages. It was available to download from the parish website. The morning it was published, 36 people downloaded it before noon. Deshaun Mobley downloaded it. He read the section on traffic stop data because he had been thinking in the months since that Tuesday morning about what he wanted to study in college. He was a senior now. Applications were due in December. He downloaded the report and read 14 pages of it, and then emailed Renata Cross, whose contact information he had found through the Public Defender's Office website, and asked if she thought civil rights law was something a person could actually do a career in, or whether it was something people talked about wanting to do and then did something else. She replied within 2 hours. She said it was absolutely a career. She said it was also frequently frustrating and occasionally heartbreaking and completely worth doing. She said that the people who were best at it were the ones who had seen clearly very early what the distance was between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked, and who had decided to spend their professional lives closing that distance. She said she had a feeling he already understood that distance better than most law students she had met. Deshaun read her reply twice, forwarded it to his mother. His mother forwarded it to his grandmother. His grandmother called him on the phone and said, "Baby, you need to become a lawyer." I was still thinking about it when he went to bed that night, which meant he was probably going to do it. The Ruth Gaines Justice Fund opened its intake process in January. In the first 6 months, it received requests for assistance from 41 Caldwell Parish residents facing excessive force claims, unlawful stop documentation, and asset forfeiture recovery. Claudette Marsh's firm, operating the fund on a pro bono basis, with the fund covering costs, took 37 of those cases. Of the 37, 22 resulted in favorable outcomes within the first year. The other 15 were still pending. It was not perfect. Justice is not a single moment. It is not a verdict or a press conference or a consent decree signing. It is the accumulated weight of choices made daily in the direction of something better by people who have decided that better is worth the cost of pursuing it. Walter understood this. He had understood it for 40 years. He understood it now the way he understood things that had moved from the mind into the bones. I understood it on a Monday morning in November when he was sitting on his front porch with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, the way he had been doing since retirement, the way Ruth had said he would do, and he had initially resisted and then discovered she was right, as she usually was. A patrol car came slowly down the street. New decals on the door. The Civilian Oversight Board seal, small and blue, visible on the rear door panel. The officer driving it was young someone Walter did not recognize. The officer lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in the way people wave when they are passing through a neighborhood they are in service to. Walter raised his own hand. The car continued down the street and turned the corner and was gone. Walter looked at his coffee. It was going cold the way coffee does when you are paying attention to something else. He took a sip anyway. He picked up the newspaper. The morning light came across the porch. The way it came across it every morning, warm and steady and indifferent to what had happened last week or last month or last year, returning the same way it always returned because light does not know anything about the things that happened in it and does not keep score. Walter kept score. He kept it the way an accountant's son keeps score carefully and accurately with a clear sense of what the numbers mean and what they do not mean. The numbers said 1 conviction, 1 resignation, 1 indictment. 3 officers terminated 47 documented incidents now in the public record. 41 parish residents seeking legal help. 37 cases taken. 22 favorable outcomes and 15 still pending. 1 quarterly report published and 3 more scheduled. 1 church with a new roof, 1 legal defense fund named after his wife, 1 17-year-old boy thinking about law school. The numbers also said 1 split lip, now healed into a small, pale scar at the corner of his mouth that his granddaughter Maya had asked about twice, and which he had explained both times the same way by saying that sometimes unfair things happen to good people, and if you are patient and brave, you can make sure they do not happen to as many other people afterward. Maya had accepted this explanation. She had then drawn a picture of her Uncle Marcus in a suit with a cape labeled superhero in her careful 7-year-old handwriting and given it to Walter, who had put it on the refrigerator where it still was. He would leave it there. Some things belong on the refrigerator. If this story has stayed with you, if it has said something that you have been thinking about for a long time in a language you recognize, please share our channel so that these stories can keep reaching the people who need them. Walter finished his coffee on the porch that November morning, set the cup on the rail, folded the newspaper, looked down the empty street for a moment. The light was the same light it had always been, steady and indifferent and returning. Then he went inside to make another cup, because the morning was still going, because there was still work to do, because justice is not a destination you arrive at and rest from. It is the direction you keep choosing every morning for as long as you are able. It is the thing you do again tomorrow and the day after that and every day after. Not because the work is ever fully done, but because the direction matters and the choosing matters, and the people who come after you will inherit the distance you covered. Walter Gaines had always been a man who got up in the morning with a clear sense of direction. I was not done yet.